when I travel through India, I can go through a street and not see any women, for example. In India, the 88% of their parliamentarians are men. Female victims of domestic violence will rarely report that they've been beaten. So I would see a patriarchal society as one where men dominate positions of prestige. So that could be in business, in government, in religion. And also that men are culturally revered, that they're seen as deserving of deference, they're recognized as respected authorities. So that could be the presumption that men are entitled to beat their wives, or men should be served dinner, they should be sitting at home while others wait on them, and they are the knowledgeable authorities. For example, in America, there's a survey of newspapers over the past 100 years, and they find that newspapers typically depict men as more intelligent. They typically depict men as geniuses. The word genius is never associated with women. So it's both dominance of political and economic positions, but also how people see men and women, how men and women treat each other. And so, though that definition of patriarchy, I would just flip that for a matriarchy. So a matriarchy would be a society in which all the big positions are dominated by women, and also women are culturally revered. So, if I may give a spoiler to the Barbie film, the new Barbie film, it's initially set in a matriarchy. Barbie Land is a matriarchy in that the Madame President is female, all the Barbie dream houses are owned by women, the Constitution is written by women, the Supreme Court is by women, and there are all these celebrations of female brilliance. So all their big prizes are won by women. Everyone thinks women are fantastic, and in that society, women are very assured and they're very assertive. So they don't have anxiety, they don't doubt themselves. When men are rude or dismissive or pester them, they just say, no, I don't have time for this. So it's the whole cultural system. So Barbie Land is a matriarchy.
And can we say actually that there's also a spectrum, right?
Yes.
Because it's like fully matriarchal or patriarchal is not always the case, right? It's not like 100%. How do you manage this kind of spectrum? And how can you judge too? How can you judge if something is actually a patriarchy or not?
So I think it's really important to pay attention to as many different indicators and as variables as possible. So there are a couple of global gender indices which are like composite. So they would include female labour force participation, female representation in parliament, gender gaps in education, and gender in health. Most Latin American countries score, if we think in a global perspective, they're usually in the sort of upper third. They're in the third most gender equal countries in the world because female labour force participation has come right up. It's around between 50 and 60%, so it's got a lot higher in most Latin American countries, but not in Brazil. Female representation has got much higher. In Brazil, it's only 18%. In other Latin American countries, it's more like 45%, 40%. And also women have mobility, they move freely in the streets, they're out and about. So compare that to when I travel through India, I can go through a street and not see any women, for example. In India, the 88% of their parliamentarians are men. Female victims of domestic violence will rarely report that they've been beaten. One, because they're so stigmatized, they're so ashamed, they don't anticipate that the police will do anything about it, and moreover, female labour force participation is so low that they are now dependent on their patriarchal guardians. Latin America is very different in that because women are increasingly working, they're much more economically independent. And because you've had these massive rallies against gender-based violence like Ni Una Menos, huge protest, that stigma has been reduced. I mean, Latin America has some of the biggest feminist protests in the world. Like 8th of March is absolutely massive in Argentina, in Mexico, etc. So we can see across the world and over time, Latin America has changed, right? But women may still experience sexual harassment, assault. Women may still face very high risk of femicide. So it's not absolutely gender equal, but if we compare it to Egypt, if we compare it to Iran, if we compare it to India, then it's more gender equal. So going back to your question, I need to be thinking about all these different variables, like the perceptions of sexual harassment, whether people see women as leaders, whether women are discriminated against at work, the kind of penalties for having your kid, etc., etc. So one needs to take a very holistic view.